drive up here, I kept thinking about a poem by Maya Angelou, and I wrote it down. I want to share it with you. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. I'm not usually nervous to speak, but I'm nervous to speak to you. I've spoken to bigger groups, richer groups, more powerful groups, but I have never spoken to a more courageous group than this one. Typically, commencement addresses give advice, but you don't need advice from me. You've lived more life than I have. You know more about the world than I do. So instead of giving you advice you don't need, I want to ask you a favor. I'll get to that later. First, I want to congratulate you on this enormous accomplishment. I want to thank your families who made this day possible, and I want to thank the professionals and teachers who love you very much. Before I was a politician, I was a middle school teacher, and I often joke that teaching middle school is the best preparation for serving in the Texas legislature. If you can handle the drama of a middle school classroom, you can certainly handle the drama at the state capitol. And honestly, some of my colleagues act like children sometimes. As a teacher turned policymaker, I do a lot of work on disrupting the school to prison pipeline and helping incarcerated minors. And oftentimes people ask me why I care so much about kids in the system. In my faith, God's eye is on the sparrow, the smallest, most vulnerable bird. As a teacher, I tried to keep my eye on the sparrows in my classroom. As a legislator, I try to keep my eye on the sparrows in our system. We as a community do better when we keep our eye on the sparrow. Because if the sparrow is safe, we know we're all safe. My experience as a teacher, as a legislator, and as a Christian tells me that birds don't belong in cages. Children don't belong in cages. People don't belong in cages. You have more than paid for your mistakes. It's not you who needs redemption. It's the rest of us. Historians tell us that mass incarceration is the most thoroughly implemented government social program in American history. We cage more of our own people than any country on the face of the earth. And it's no longer just prisons, it's an entire prison industrial complex in which a lot of companies make a lot of money locking a lot of people away. We know, based on decades of research, that who gets locked up is not necessarily who breaks the law. Most of us have broken the law at some point in our lives, and some of the most powerful people in this country have committed the most egregious crimes. It's not about law breaking, it's about race, it's about class. Mass incarceration disproportionately hurts Black and brown people, poor folks, immigrants, and people with disabilities. In fact, individuals with severe mental illness in this country are 3 times more likely to be in a prison than in a hospital. In the past 50 years, we built more and more prisons, even as the crime rate fell. Even study after study proved that incarceration actually makes crime worse because of the profound harm it does to people and communities. Thankfully, criminal justice reform is gaining bipartisan support. As we speak, activists and advocates across the state, across this country, are pushing to require air conditioning in state facilities, are pushing to ban private prisons, are pushing to abolish the death penalty, and pushing to end solitary confinement. That's difficult and critical work. In fact, some of you are graduating today because of a small but important policy change we made last year. But it's not enough. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. And I often think about what if instead of tweaking the carceral system, we questioned the system itself? What if we came together to create something different, something new? All of us, those like me who designed this system, those who work in this system, and those who are directly hurt by this system. Most of the current conversation around criminal justice reform is focused on low-level, nonviolent offenses, sympathetic crimes like marijuana possession. But a majority of people in prison have been convicted of violent offenses, so the more difficult question, the more important question, the more radical question is what to do about violence. I learned what violence was at a very early age. My father was a high school dropout who had a drinking problem, and he oftentimes would become abusive. He actually spent time in jail himself. And when I was young, I hated my father for hurting me and my mother. I was glad he went to jail. But as I got older, I realized that the system never actually helped my father get better. Instead of ending his violence by treating his alcoholism, addressing his mental health issues, or giving him a high school diploma, they threw him in a cage, which only made things worse. I learned that violence is a problem that cages will never solve. When I say violence, I mean hurting oneself or others, physically, verbally, psychologically, spiritually. We all recognize domestic abuse as violence, but we don't always recognize the ways in which our systems hurt people every day. Poverty is violence. Pollution is violence. And yes, prison is violence. As a government official, I can say the government has a monopoly on violence. And through mass incarceration, our government inflicts a toxic level of violence on its own citizens, on the same black and brown communities targeted by its social and economic violence for centuries. Violence is the opposite of love. As the author Bell Hooks wrote, love and abuse cannot coexist. One night before my father went to jail, he became violent again. But that night, my mother's love rose to meet it. She packed all our belongings in her little Ford Escort, and she drove me to the hotel where she worked. She begged the manager to let us stay in one of the rooms until she could find an apartment. Thankfully, he agreed. She didn't have money, she didn't have a home, she didn't have a college degree, but she had love for me. My mother taught me the meaning of true love. True love is not passive, true love is not neutral, true love is not weak. Its power changes the world. And she also taught me that love was even powerful enough to change people like my father. That idea that love is the only antidote to violence is a dangerous idea, the most dangerous idea in the world. So dangerous that it's gotten most of its founders murdered or killed, from Jesus Christ to Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King. Violence is the operating principle of the world, and it's not going to go down without a fight. But Jesus, Gandhi, and King struggled to establish a new order based on love, not violence. And all three were persecuted by the justice systems of their day. All three understood that violence is a descending spiral, and the only way to stop it is to abstain from it entirely, to turn the other cheek and have the courage to counter violence with love. Here's how Dr. King put it: returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. This idea, this dangerous idea, came to be known as nonviolence. Scripture warns, do not repay evil for evil. I've never understood why people say fight fire with fire. It doesn't make any sense. You don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. As a society, why do we hurt people? To teach people that hurting people is wrong. Prisons punish certain kinds of violence with their own kinds of violence. Too many prisons, instead of rehabilitating people, isolate them. Instead of repairing communities, weaken them. Instead of transforming violence, escalate it. Instead of fighting fire with water, too many prisons fight fire with gasoline. Maybe that's why Jesus began his ministry by proclaiming freedom for the prisoners. Through his teachings, he sought to establish a new kind of justice, free of retribution, rooted in reconciliation and forgiveness, work that Gandhi and King would carry on 2,000 years later. When I first became an educator, one of my mentor teachers told me something that I've never forgotten. Pain that is not transformed is transferred. In other words, a wound can't be ignored, a wound has to be healed. Violence is not true power. It can destroy, but it cannot create. It takes nothing to destroy a flower but love. Love can make a flower grow out of concrete. Love can transform pain before it's transferred. Love can turn an inmate into a graduate. What violence can't do, love can. What if we built a system rooted in love and not violence? What if our goal was reconciliation, not retribution? What if our goal was healing, not vengeance? What if our goal was community, not exile? What if we believed that every human being is sacred, endowed with infinite worth and entitled to unconditional love? And what if we saw in other people what we see in ourselves, the capacity for growth and change and redemption? Dr. Cornel West once said, "Justice is love in public." If that's true, then we need a different system of justice in this country. The good news is that activists and educators and policymakers around the country, including in places like this, are pioneering a new approach with very deep roots. Restorative justice takes its inspiration from indigenous communities in which the goal of a justice system is to disrupt the spiral of violence, not contribute to it. In a restorative justice model, the question is how to right a wrong, not how to punish a wrong. The focus is on the person who was hurt, not the person who did the hurting. A survivor's needs are better met when the person who committed violence accepts responsibility and repairs the harm done to the victim and the community. Studies show that this restorative justice approach is much more likely than imprisonment to decrease crime and violence. When I was a middle school teacher, sometimes my students did bad things, as all middle schoolers do. Sometimes they hurt other students. Sometimes they needed to be temporarily removed to protect themselves and others, but the goal was always to bring them back into the classroom community. I tried to teach them how to take responsibility for their actions and right their wrongs, and as their teacher, I would never mimic their violence. It was my job to show a different path entirely. Restorative justice is not easy. Throwing people in cages is much easier, but it's the only way to achieve true public safety. It's the only way to achieve love in public. My mother taught me that love is not passive. It's confrontation, it's engagement, it's transformation. It's much harder than violence, and it takes much more courage. But this conversation has to be bigger than prisons. If violence is systemic, then love must be systemic. What would a nonviolent government look like? Instead of criminalizing, policing, and imprisoning communities, a nonviolent government would refuse to repay evil with evil, and instead would respond to evil with good. Anti-prison activist Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, "Prisons are a catch-all solutions to our social problems. Prisons allow us to ignore the consequences of systemic racism and global capitalism. If we took just half of what we spend on wars, prisons, and policing, and spent it on education, healthcare, and jobs, we could make prisons obsolete." Research tells us that expanding Medicaid reduces crime, increasing SNAP benefits reduces crime, education reduces crime, clean air and clean water reduces crime. A less violent government leads to a less violent society. If we expect protesters to be nonviolent, if we expect citizens to be nonviolent, then surely we can expect our own government to be nonviolent as well. So here's the favor. I'm supposed to tell you to leave this place, become productive members of society, and never look back. But that's not what you are called to do. I'm not asking you to join the system. I'm asking you to change the system. Dismantle this system of violence, build something new, something better, something rooted in love. It's hard to imagine a world without prisons, but it's also hard to imagine a world without telegrams and cassette tapes. Just because it's hard to imagine doesn't mean you shouldn't. We won't build it overnight, but dreaming is the first step. Dreaming of things unknown but longed for still. You have to be those dreamers. You carry within you a seed for a better future. You are the light of the world. If you look out these stained glass windows, you'd see flowers blooming and birds returning. In spring, we celebrate new beginnings, baptisms, weddings, and graduations. After all, the word commencement means beginning. It's also the holiest time of year. Billions of people all over the world are preparing to observe Passover, Easter, and Ramadan. Their hymns of hope remind us that out of despair comes hope, out of darkness comes light, out of death comes life. In spring, what was once dead becomes resurrected. In my faith tradition, our symbol is the cross. The cross represents violence in all its forms. The cross is racism, the cross is poverty, the cross is incarceration. Jesus died on that cross on a distant hill with forgiveness on his lips, defeating violence by refusing to mirror it. You've been crucified on your own cross, but today you are risen, a new being destined to build a new world. So shine your light, sing your song, and remember the words of Maya Angelou. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Thank you for sharing this day with me. Thank you for inspiring me. And thank you for building a better world. Congratulations.